Well, Beth, don't you know it's that time of year again?
That's right. AP Lang season.
Can you hear me or what? Well, Beth, don't
Yes.
you know it's that I need to mute that. Oh, hold on. Woo. Had to mute the tab there. Beth, it's super nice to see you. You're going to notice a new name in the chat here, Beth, and this is George. And folks, George is going to be our moderator for tonight. And the reason why is because our normal moderator, whose name is Alexi, is not able to be with us for multiple reasons. And one of those reasons, hopefully, you may have picked up when you saw the countdown timer, is that she lost someone that was very close to her today. And that is incredibly tragic. It was a former student of hers that was also a child of a colleague. And we want to just respect that in relation to Ms. Dar's circumstance. So she's not going to be with us here tonight. And instead, I brought in an actual student of mine named George. And George, feel free to turn on your camera if you want to, but if you don't want to, that's okay. But folks, George is going to be our moderator for tonight. He's going to help run the chat here. And what's going to happen is when Beth and I ask questions, if we can't, or if you're asking questions, if we can't pick up on them quickly enough in the chat, George will drop them in the Zoom chat here for us, so we'll know to focus on those. And then George will also make sure that you all are being appropriate in the chat. And hopefully, George, you'll have to do like very little work at all. But I also want to just point out that the reason why AP Lang is so important, folks, is because you can get more stuff from your teachers. You can get more stuff from your teachers if you know how to be rhetorical in nature. So when I asked George to be the moderator for this, I said, what do you normally do on a Thursday night? And he was like, well, I typically have vocal ensemble, but he doesn't have vocal ensemble tonight. And then I said, can I convince you for a Garden of English t-shirt to moderate our YouTube live tonight? And he pushed back a little bit and he was like, I'm not sure that I can do that for a t-shirt, but I think I can do that for a hooded sweatshirt. So sure enough, he pushed back. He was remarkably persuasive. He knew that there was some supply and demand. And so he's going to get a Garden of English hoodie sweatshirt on his desk in the morning. So, George, that will be there for you. And we appreciate what you're doing here. I did see your comment, George, in our Zoom chat that says, hey, there's a delay from YouTube to Zoom. And that's true. There's about a 20-second delay. So it's something that you kind of learn to navigate. And now the entire YouTube world knows that that happens. But folks, please note that if you are being inappropriate in the chat or anything like that, George will either mute you, delete your comment, or just remove you from the chat in and of itself. Also, George, if Beth and I are ever talking about anything and you have a student perspective about something, feel free to chime in. You're welcome to do that here. Okay. But Beth, I'm assuming that you've been perusing that chat. Who do we need to shout out to or anything like that as we get this show on the road?
We got a couple of shout out requests. We've got Ms. Smith. Ms. Hunt is here. I saw a couple, I think Ms. Cody.
Awesome.
There was one more that Ms. Bishop.
All right. And I saw some people coming in from California. We've got North Carolina. Let's see. I know that Sunshine's from the Pacific Northwest. I don't know if it's Oregon or if it's Washington, though. And Sunshine, if I got that wrong, you can judge me harshly. How does that sound? Ms. Julie Reed from Elkin. Shout out to Ms. Reed. Mr. Urasek. I think I already shouted out to Mr. Urasek in the comments, and I feel like it's a name we shout out often. Don't you, Beth?
Yes, and we appreciate the support.
Yes. Oh, and then all right. What about is it Ms. Spitz? Like, I still don't know if we know the phonetics on that one, but that one comes up an awful lot too.
Yes. I think is it spies maybe?
Oh,
I don't know.
spies,
They
maybe.
tell us
Okay.
every time, and we
I know.
always
It's because we're trash bags. That's why. But awesome. Awesome. And then we've got let's see, someone's coming here from Edinburgh North. And oh, hey, I'm thankful that your teacher recommends our stuff. That's pretty cool. We've got California here as well. Awesome. And then Castle Park High School. Hey, thank you for joining us from California and all of that kind of stuff. So as these come in, by all means, we'll try to shout some people out as long as it's not getting in the way. Beth, let's actually start tonight, though, by telling people what we're going to cover today so that they don't ask questions about things that we're not covering. So tell us what's up, Beth.
All right. Well, if you joined us last time, because by the way, this is the second of 4 YouTube lives that we're doing. Last time we talked more about multiple choice. I believe this time we're talking about rhetorical analysis because unfortunately I won't be here next time, but we've got a great replacement. Katie Storms is going to be joining. And
For
then,
sure.
yes, and we're going back together again right before the exam, the night before. That one's always a fun because that one's kind of our free for all. But we're going to be covering rhetorical analysis, I believe, tonight. And depending on what we can get through, we might be able to touch upon a couple other subjects, but we like to try to focus on maybe one FRQ type per event. That way we get everybody's questions answered.
Awesome. And also, let me just, I saw that question about the quick tips. And George, I appreciate you being completely honest there in the chat. Let me actually just check out the quick tips here. Yeah, the quick tips from last time are going to work for this time as well, except for maybe a little bit of the synthesis stuff. But I can build into the quick tip synthesis sheet as well. But anyway, yeah, that's true. We're going to do rhetorical analysis. We're going to do some synthesis. And then the next time through, I'm going to have Katie Storms here, and she's going to join me, and we're going to finish up synthesis and talk about argument. Okay, super cool. So Beth, tell us a little bit about you and what you do with Coach Hall Writes. And just so you know, folks, Coach Hall, Beth Hall with Coach Hall Writes, her YouTube channel is linked in the description right down below. So you want to go subscribe to her as well. But Beth, tell us about what you do there, and let's actually start getting into some tips for writing the rhetorical analysis essay. Shout out to Banning High School, shout out to Castle Park High School, shout out to Sheridan Hills Christian High School, and then the teacher, Ms. Mann, shout out to you as well. Okay. And then Natasha, for the editing access, Natasha, for that quick tip sheet, it should just force you to make a copy. You just need to click make a copy. But if there's a problem with that, just let me know and I'll figure out how to get it to you. Anyway, if anybody has questions about rhetorical analysis, this is the time to bombard is the word I was looking for. Bombard the chat with your questions about rhetorical analysis, and Beth and I are going to start talking about it. So Beth, tell me about this rhetorical analysis task on AP exam day.
Okay, so honestly, I think the rhetorical analysis one is my favorite. And that's because I like the idea of analyzing a speech or a letter. It could even be an excerpt of a passage, like a memoir, perhaps. So it's going to be nonfiction. And basically, the task itself is to analyze the rhetoric, so the use of the language, and connect it to the author's message, argument, or purpose. And I think this can be a useful skill beyond the Lang exam as well, because kind of like you were talking about earlier when George was negotiating for that sweatshirt, you got to know your audience and make certain choices as well. So I think it can be a very valuable skill for students, but I do want to recognize that for some students, this one is probably the hardest essay at times because of perhaps the critical thinking that is involved. And so today we're going to hopefully give you some strategies to help make it a little bit more manageable and also just to reinforce what you've been covering in class this year.
Yeah, and one of the things that's true is that every year the rhetorical analysis essay is the one that scores the lowest. Now, one of the things that I would like to point out is that what's nice about the rhetorical analysis essay is that if you can write the rhetorical analysis essay, all 3 AP Lit essays can actually use the same type of format. There's a little bit of a difference here, but not a ton. And because of that, if you can learn how to write a strong rhetorical analysis, it's going to translate very well to AP Lit for those of you that take AP Lang as juniors and AP Lit as seniors here. So here's a good question. Let's actually start here, Beth, because you're right. Rhetorical analysis is typically the lowest scoring essay. And there's a question that shows up in here that you and I get all the time. And it says, what are some strategies to remember rhetorical choices? I keep forgetting when it's time to write. Interesting, because I think that there's a common problem here that we see all the time, and let's actually try to address it.
Okay, so one of the things we want to remember is that a rhetorical choice is best expressed as a verb. And you might not have heard of rhetorical choices before this class, and that's okay. You might have heard of devices, which are nouns. Now, the good news is we can take a noun in a lot of cases and turn it into a verb. So some of the common ones that students write about might be things like repetition, which is a noun, but you can say repeats. There's comparison or contrast. So we could say compares, contrasts, juxtaposes. And those are just like a couple, but there are several. Now, I know there's some really long lists out there with some really fancy terminology. Personally, I don't advocate for students trying to memorize those lists because usually it's a list of nouns anyway. So we want to be using those rhetorically accurate verbs to convey what the speaker is doing, which is actually, I think, a helpful tip because one of the other questions that we get asked sometimes is, what do I do if I don't see any rhetorical choices? Which I can imagine would be very stressful in the moment. And so we want to remember that if you can convey what they're doing, like, are they acknowledging something? Are they justifying something? That's a choice. Also, for what it's worth, when in doubt, there should presumably be word choice that you could talk about. And word choice, remember, creates tone. So there should be something there to analyze. But also, if you're looking for more help with this, I can drop a couple links in the chat. Tim and I both have videos on essentially like what is a rhetorical choice. And I know I have a couple videos on some of the more common ones that I've seen students write about. So, not that I'm suggesting that you memorize a list, but I know sometimes students like to have a handful of common ones. The one thing I will say though is we don't want to assume that these choices are in all passages though. So, not all passages are going to have repetition. You know, you're not going to see an author comparing something or alluding to something in all passages. So it's good to know some rhetorical choices, but at the end of the day, we want to go to the passage and ask ourselves, okay, what is this person doing to convey their message, achieve their purpose, or develop their argument?
Yeah, I really appreciate, the idea that we don't need to focus on those kind of cumbersome word lists, right? And I'm going to try to actually answer the question too by taking what you said about verbs, right? With rhetorical choices and verbs. In the chat on the YouTube channel, I just actually put in some things that say choice verbs. Folks, when we do a rhetorical analysis, we want to say, what are the choices the author is making? And if you can't figure out a way to actually identify the choice that the author is making, what I need you to do is I need you to try to say, okay, if I see this text and I know that something's happening here, what can I say the author is doing? I put some choice verbs in the chat. And so instead of memorizing simile, metaphor, parallel structure, memorize these verbs to say what the author is doing. And honestly, any rhetorical choice can typically be correlated with any one of these verbs: presents, describes, narrates, incorporates, includes, details, refutes, challenges, repeats, or exemplifies. Those are really strong verbs there for rhetorical choices. Now, I did see, oh, hold on. We got to do some shout outs here. We need to shout out to Mrs. Ake. We need to shout out to Southwest High School. We need to shout out to Ms. Kenny Quinn. And then Southwest High School as well. So we got to get those out there. Shout those out there. But please note, in the chat, once again, you will actually find some choice verbs. Now, one of the questions that shows up here, someone said, what is the correct format when writing rhetorical analysis? I have trouble with my commentary and sometimes go off topic. Now, we'll talk about commentary in a little bit because somebody also said, do you have any tips to spice up commentary? And I'm pretty sure that you and I have tons of those. But one of the things that I would like to point out here is, the commentary question's coming up a ton here in the chat here, Beth. But one of the things that I want to point out is that in order to do a rhetorical analysis and make it easier, you have to know what the rhetorical effect of something is. So you need to be able to say the author is making this choice with the language, and here's why. So a strategy for actually helping with the why part, which is going to eventually help you with your commentary, is to know some verbs that can help you understand the effect of the rhetoric. And I also put those verbs in the chat here. So I have to highlight, to showcase, to emphasize, to reiterate, to promote, and to evoke. And so now if I think about having these verbs in hand, I can say, oh, the author details blank in order to evoke this particular emotion. And if I can use those verbs here, it's going to be way easier than memorizing those kind of cumbersome lists that you mentioned just a few minutes ago. But Beth, let's talk about format first, and then we'll talk about that commentary part. Someone wants to know shout out to Philadelphia. Who was it? Oh no, we already did that. Never mind. I take it back. Southwest High. Boop. Okay. Beth, tell me about the format for responding for a rhetorical analysis? Is there a be-all, end-all format that we have to just absolutely do?
No, there isn't. Now, there are some common traits that we see among many essays, though. So we can kind of talk about that. First of all, obviously, your essay is going to start with some type of introduction. Now, worst case scenario, if you don't have a lot of time, it's okay to have a short intro. I think you and I both advocate for short intros anyway.
Yeah,
But
I actually advocate for just the thesis being the intro paragraph, honestly.
yes, we want to earn that thesis point, and I like to see a little bit of a setup. Tim and I both have sentence frames to help students write one because we don't want to just say like, I don't know, speaker does this and this. Like, give us a little bit of context, and you can get that information from the prompt. So you can weave that into your thesis. Some students like to add a little bit of perhaps the broader context. If it's maybe a historical speech, some of my students might have outside knowledge from like a push or something, so they might add in a little bit of context if they have time. They can also actually, like, since it's a digital exam this year, they
Mhm.
sometimes will go back and fill that in later, if like they'll write the thesis and come back to the intro if they need a little bit. If they have more time, they can develop it that way. But please don't stress out about having the perfect hook, because the real way to earn points in rhetorical analysis is through your body paragraphs. So we
Yeah.
want to get that thesis point. We want to have those rhetorical choices. So we're looking for at least two because it's plural. And I like to see even though it's technically not a required component of the rubric, I like to see a reference to the specific message, argument, or purpose, whichever one the prompt is asking for. So that's the first thing we got to get out of the way. Now, the next question that we often get is, how many body paragraphs do I need? And this question applies to other essays as well. So to be honest, a lot of my students tend to do two well-developed body paragraphs. Some students like to do three. It might even depend on the passage that you're given and how much time you have. But I would say typically the minimum I tend to see is two, the maximum I tend to see is three. And there's not a magical formula to this, in the sense that a well-written essay that has two body paragraphs is still eligible for just as many points as a well-written essay that has three body paragraphs.
Yep.
You don't get bonus points for throwing in an extra paragraph. So just to address that. Now, in class, your teacher might require three body paragraphs, let's say. And so we don't want to contradict rules for their classroom.
Yeah.
But on exam day, some students I have found are surprised to learn that they technically can only do they can do two body paragraphs and do it well and still score well.
Right,
So,
because the scoring rubric says that a student analyzes multiple choices. So that means
yes.
more than one, and that their commentary is consistent. So it provides examples for multiple choices, and the commentary consistently follows such. And we will talk about commentary, folks, I promise, but right now we're just talking about formatting. So anyway, yes, keep going.
Okay, so the next question, I'll come back to body paragraphs because I know we want to talk about commentary, but that's the body paragraphs are where we look for your evidence and commentary. And there are 4 points for that. You can earn up to four. The other question that we're often asked is, do I need a conclusion? Now, I would say, to be clear, it's not a requirement, but if you have the time, I would encourage you to write one. Now, there have been many times in class where my students have been working on their body paragraph and they really didn't have enough time for a conclusion. So they just kind of wrapped up the essay as they were ending that body paragraph. But if you have time, especially if you can perhaps situate it in a broader context and maybe think about the impact of the speech, if it's a historical thing, or maybe the impact of the message. Tim and I both have videos on conclusions for rhetorical analysis. So if you have time to craft a conclusion paragraph, I would encourage you to do so. But I also want to say, to alleviate some stress, if you simply don't have time for it, focus on those body paragraphs instead.
All right. Yeah, I completely agree. The conclusion is one of those things that's not going to contribute to the one to row A or row B. So the one for the thesis point or up to four for evidence and commentary. Strong conclusion can help contribute to sophistication, but we can deal with that a little bit later. And actually, last year, we do AP Lang senior year at my school, but my juniors last year who took AP Lit and my seniors last year were taking AP Lang. They all told me that they wrote their thesis and body paragraphs first, and then with the 15 to 20 minutes left over, they went back and added conclusions and whatnot. And so it's that. Now, there are a couple of good questions that have already showed up in the chat that kind of correlate with stuff that we're talking about. But just to be clear, in terms of formatting your rhetorical analysis essay, okay, it's best to have a thesis and then some body paragraphs. I'm going to address one about rhetorical devices in a couple minutes, okay? One of the questions was, do any of the essays require full introduction paragraphs? The answer is no, not in a time setting. You need to know how to write an intro paragraph for college books. Like, let's be real.
Mhm.
And for any process paper, we're not saying that intro paragraphs are not important to know how to do. What we're saying is that to maximize your time on exam day, you can use just your thesis as your first paragraph. I've been teaching my students to do that for years because an exam day essay is not an essay itself. Does that mean intro paragraphs are not important? No, it's a skill you should have. But on exam day, that's not actually doing anything. There's a potential that writing an intro is not going to do much to help your score unless it's really sophisticated. Okay, which I have seen, by the way. But your thesis can work as your intro paragraph. My students do that all the time. They score very, very, very well. Now, here's a question, Beth, right? You had mentioned that you want your kids to address the message or the purpose in the thesis, right? Because the prompt typically says, analyze the choices that so-and-so makes to convey her message about, about child labor, okay? And you're suggesting that you want students to articulate what the message about child labor is. Well, somebody asked, does misinterpreting the author's purpose lead to a bad essay? I want to hear your response, and then I will talk about my experience as a question leader, even as a question leader for rhetorical analysis.
So I guess to me, it's one of those things that it's a tough question to answer in a sense because to me, I always wonder about the execution of it. Like, how far off are we? Was it just that one tiny part that was off? Is it consistently off? But sometimes a misread does lead to a score of a 1-2-0. But at the same time, so because I don't want students to think, oh, I'm worried I don't understand the purpose. I should just not try to address that because the purpose is a part of the rhetorical situation. And so I think it's important to kind of perhaps number one, a lot of the prompts use the College Board will give you extra phrasing. Like they can stop it at the phrase to achieve their purpose, but a lot of times they will actually give you a clue as to what the purpose is. And in those cases, we want students to use that as essentially like a springboard and to go deeper. But in my experience, when I've seen a student very strongly misinterpret the purpose, but the rest of the essay, they still clearly tried and they had the components. It tended to be a 1-2-0. But I also want to put the caveat out there that that's just my experience. It's also I really do think we need to recognize that readers are looking at things on a case by case basis, and readers are also trying to read supportively. We want to be clear that we're not looking to take away points, but rather students are earning points as they go. And I think that shift in mindset can also be really helpful for students to recognize as well.
Another thing too about the misinterpreting the author's purpose, you can still score a 1 for a thesis and a 2 for evidence and commentary if you misinterpret the author's purpose a little bit. Now, if you fully misinterpret it, so let's pretend that I'm doing the Florence Kelly example. Folks, if you don't know the Florence Kelly example, after this live, you should go YouTube, AP Lang, Florence Kelly. It's a great speech about child labor. If a student tells me that Florence Kelly, includes this and repeats this in order to highlight how important child labor is to the economy of the United States, that's not going to get a thesis point because it's actually entirely incorrect. And then if a student actually provides evidence and commentary, the commentary is going to be incorrect, but that student will still score a 2 if there's an attempt at commentary in row B. So it'll be a 0-2-0. So we do want to make sure, though, that we do try to interpret our piece correctly. Now, I have never actually really seen a thesis that attempts to do what a thesis is supposed to. I hardly ever see one that does not earn the thesis point. So thesis points are actually decently easy to get as long as kids are on topic with that author's message or purpose. But I also have seen thesis points awarded if the prompt says, in order to convey Kelly's message about child labor, I've seen kids say Kelly does A and B to convey her message about child labor. That will get the thesis point. It's not a strong thesis. Beth, you're right. We really should be saying what her message is, but it can get the point. Now, let's look at this next question. This is a good one. It says if you have 3 paragraphs that's not layered, and what layered paragraphs means, folks, is that you have evidence, commentary, evidence, commentary. And don't forget, folks, we will talk about ways to better your commentary. But if we have evidence, commentary, evidence, commentary, we have 3 paragraphs that are not that. It's just choice, evidence, commentary. Next paragraph, choice, evidence, commentary. Next paragraph, choice, evidence, commentary. If it has solid evidence and commentary, is that acceptable?
Yeah.
Absolutely. 100%, folks, that's acceptable. In fact, you don't even need 3 body paragraphs. Beth, how many can you get away with?
2.
2. That's right. You can get away with 2. Now, I tell my students, we want to strive for 3. We really do. We want to show that we have a complete understanding of things. You want to pull a rhetorical choice from the beginning, you want to pull a rhetorical choice from the middle, and you want to pull a rhetorical choice from the end. I really strive for that with my kids. But I think that there's a lot of kind of misinformation out there that says that you have to have, a topic sentence that deals with one choice. You put your evidence in, you provide your commentary, you add more evidence, you provide your commentary, then you move to body paragraph 2. Those layered paragraphs, they're on exam day. If I look at the scoring rubric, it says that you analyze multiple choices and provide evidence and commentary for them. Multiple just means more than 1. So whether you've got 2 or whether you've got 6, Beth, you had already said it, you could get the maximum score for that. So that came through. Somebody asked if there's a countdown clock for the each FRQ or if it's for the whole section, and it's actually a countdown timer for the whole section. You can budget your time as you see fit. And rhetorical analysis is question 2, and I do recognize that we're talking about question 2 first and not question 1, but that's because it fit very well with reading multiple choice in our last one. Mm-hmm. All right, let's see what else do I have to pull from here. All right, so Beth, somebody asked about this. How do we? Sorry, there was something about rhetorical devices in the thesis. So, what's your recommendation about listing device? Well, I know what you're going to say first, but the question is, what's your recommendation about listing rhetorical devices in the thesis itself?
So are we asking more about devices or like a closed thesis or?
Yeah, I think the question really seems to be how many devices do I have to have, and do I encourage 2 body paragraphs? But I think that the person might be using rhetorical devices and rhetorical choices synonymously.
Okay,
as we run into.
Right. So I would say the minimum is 2. Because you're going to want 2 body paragraphs, and ideally we would have those be phrased as a verb if possible to make it a choice. If it is a noun,
just real quick, Beth, I'm going to just give another example of that just so that we can clarify. If you wanted to say so and so uses a metaphor, what Beth and I would encourage you to do would say, no, we want you to say so and so contrasts blank with blank, or so and so compares blank with blank. Or right. instead of saying so and so uses the story, we would want you to say so and so narrates a time when blah blah blah. Sorry, Beth.
Right. And so just using those verbs can be helpful. But to be fair, you can still earn the point by saying, uses, diction. And a lot of English teachers, we really don't like to see uses. It's a very weak verb. Yeah. But technically, it would still get the point. And I think the thing to remember is that to be defensible is not necessarily synonymous with good. It just means that, or strong, it just means that you can defend it. And so there's a range for all the thesis statements of what is acceptable. And so Tim and I both advocate for using those verbs because we believe it strengthens the quality of the writing. You would want 2 or 3, depending on how many body paragraphs you're going to do, especially for a closed thesis, which is basically when a student kind of specifies exactly which choices they're going to be looking at in that order. So whatever the first choice is, we assume that's going to be body paragraph 1. The second choice is body paragraph 2, and so on. The one thing I've seen rarely, but I've seen a few times, is sometimes students try to throw in several. Like I've seen students try to include maybe up to 6. And in my opinion, that is way too many because you can't do that justice at all. And I think that kind of goes back to the earlier question, because a lot of my videos, I advocate for layered paragraphs because that's just what works for my students. But the reason why I advocate for those layers is because I've seen oftentimes that without it, my students underdevelop their ideas.
Yeah.
And so, whereas, with some of Tim's students, they might do what would be considered one. You looked at the paragraphs side by side and you looked at the evidence to commentary ratios, they might be equal, even though they might be structured slightly differently. Because at the end of the day, what we're both advocating for is well-developed analysis.
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, somebody actually just gave us a shout out about how we just kind of condemn the word uses. First of all, folks, I have scored plenty of good papers, right? Like 141s that say things like so and so uses an anecdote, uses a metaphor, and uses a whatever. So I don't want anybody to leave here and be like, my teacher tells us to use the word uses, and Freitas and Hall said no, and now I like having an existential crisis a month before the exam. No, folks, we are here to support and to give you some different ways to do things that might work well with you. Okay. But I would like to point out that I also don't allow my kids to say utilize. I also don't allow my kids to say employs because they're just fancy ways to
Right.
say
My
uses.
students want to do that too. They're like, but it's fancier, and it's like, nope, it's still the same family. But the other thing too is I firmly believe in meeting students where they are. And so some of the
Yeah.
students that I've worked with, getting them to correctly identify a rhetorical choice or device and say uses, that was a win. And the goal, like they got the thesis point, they achieved their goal. So
Mm-hmm.
if you are comfortable with uses and you do have some time to kind of practice and try these verbs, but at the same time, that's probably not where I would spend all my focus, if I'm being honest, because it's a cosmetic thing. And so if we don't want to add any additional stress to anybody, but I think probably a few of you in the chat have probably heard your teacher say not to use the word uses, which I just used the word uses in the sentence. And so therefore I kind
Oh,
of defeated my point.
well, I always tell my students that they're never to use the word use unless they're telling people not to use or if they're speaking about female sheep. So that's kind of how we roll here. Somebody asked in here what verbs could they actually use instead, and I just posted those in the chat again. Some good rhetorical choice verbs just went straight into the chat. And then George has given some advice about what he does as a student. And George, I really appreciate you adding that advice and doing what you're doing in there. Thank you very much for that. All right, now let's talk about commentary here. Somebody wants us to talk a little bit more about layered paragraphs. One thing though is before we do so, somebody did ask about like thesis structure and whatnot. Now, folks, you have to realize we only have an hour here, and we get a lot of questions coming in. And Beth and I are trying to give a nice, overarching look at things. So I bring this up because if you look right in the description of this video, you're going to see a document that's a quick tip sheet, and I have my thesis statement templates in there with examples. And then, excuse me, if you go to Beth Hall's channel and just do Coach Hall Writes Rhetorical Analysis Thesis, we have videos that explain exactly that and give you templates and models, which are much more effective than us spending like 30 seconds on here talking about it. So just know that all of that stuff is linked up in the description down below, and a quick little search in YouTube will help you as well. Okay. Now let's talk about commentary here, because people have asked, how do I get better commentary? How do I deal with commentary? And this is honestly where most people struggle, right? And this is why a lot of kids get 1 2 zeros instead of 1 3 zeros, or 1 3 zeros instead of 1 4 zeros. Oh, Mrs. Parcells from Castle Park High School, your kids love you. So anyway, tell us, Beth, what are some of the ways that we can develop our commentary for our rhetorical analysis? And then in about 7 minutes, in about 5 minutes, we'll talk about sophistication a little bit quickly, and then we'll move on to talking about some synthesis stuff that I'll carry over into my conversation with Katie in just a couple weeks.
Awesome. Okay, so I did put a video in the chat that students might be interested in watching later because it gives some of my best tips for rhetorical analysis in terms of like content, the commentary there. I also want to shout out some of Tim's videos too, because he has, I think you did like a whole like 3-part series a couple years ago about commentary, and he and I both have sentence frames, or sometimes they're called templates. And these are a support for student writing. It's a way for you to plug in your own ideas and kind of learn to craft stronger sentences. So if you're struggling with this, we both have videos about this as well. And we have slightly different approaches. So you kind of, it's basically like kind of pick and choose what works for you.
Yeah.
For me, I like to see students attempting to really connect to the rhetorical situation. And I think sometimes some of the facets of that get ignored. And so, for those who might be unaware, the rhetorical situation is, I like the acronym SPACE CAT. Some people use soapstone, some people don't use an acronym at all, but it's speaker, purpose, audience, context, and exigence. So basically, each passage is going to have those components, maybe not all equally present per se, but they're going to be there. And so I tell my students to ask themselves this question: why does the writer or speaker make this choice for this audience on this occasion? Because we really want analysis, we want to be analyzing why. And so I will, in class, have my students think about, okay, what are the person's credentials? Like, what do we know about them from the prompt? What are they valuing? Like, what are their needs, their beliefs, their values, and how does that influence their speech? What's their relationship with the audience? Are they friendly with the audience? Is it a hostile relationship? Because that will influence the choices they make as well. And a lot of times I think students know this information, but they maybe don't put it in their essay. And I think that's one way to strengthen commentary is, I've seen so many times students will use soapstone or space cat, and they'll just kind of write out, the letter, and they'll write some notes. And then they don't really do anything with that info in their essay. And if that's the case, it's kind of a waste of time. And so we want to be incorporating what we're thinking about with the rhetorical situation into our essay by really just thinking about, okay, why are they doing this? Because and this goes back to something I saw in the chat that we haven't addressed yet. We need to remember that speakers tailor their writing or their speech to the audience, and they also are going to make choices in a certain order to be more effective. And so that's why if you saw somebody mentioning like sectioning the text or chunking the text, that's kind of why, is we don't really want rhetorical analysis to be some sort of scavenger hunt. I tell my students it's not Where's Waldo, like we're not just
No.
looking for first
Yeah.
edition. But we want to, Tim mentioned earlier, 3 paragraphs, if you're doing 3, beginning, middle, and end. So we want to be thinking about, okay, what are they doing in the beginning and why, the middle and why, and the end and why. And so my big tip for commentary is to really dig into the rhetorical situation, because I think a lot of times, especially in those essays that score a 1-2-0, I think
Yep.
students kind of gloss over it. They miss that analysis. And it's, to me, oftentimes it feels like the missing piece that perhaps would have elevated the essay.
Yeah. So another thing too, when it comes to commentary, and this is one of the things that I experienced at the reading a lot, is when students are trying to produce commentary. Folks, what commentary is you're trying to argue how your evidence conveys what your claim was. And if you said that an author narrated a short story from his or her childhood to get the audience sad, let's say, and I know that's a terrible word, but, or sorry, to evoke sadness from the audience, you're going to put the evidence in of that short little story from the author's childhood, and then you need to explain how that story would make someone sad. But what typically happens is my students are like, okay, so here's the evidence, and this would obviously make somebody sad. What commentary is it's trying to get you past saying obviously. And a lot of times students know what evidence to pick, and they know what the rhetorical effect is. Oh, the audience is supposed to be sad here, but they don't know how to articulate the connection that they made while they were viewing it in their paper. But that's what we want. That's what commentary is. It's articulating how you made that connection that seems so obvious to you. And so what we need to do now in our commentary is we need to actually set up structures that can help us get that out when we don't know how to. And George put it in the chat, and I think it's the key word right there. Folks, your commentary, if you're trying to make it better, the very first step that you could take is the word because. Now, I'm going to throw George under the bus here for just a moment. But the other day he was in my class, and he's been with me for 3 years, and he was like, Freitas, now that I've used your commentary stems for so long, I've realized how much I don't want to use them anymore. But the thing is that he still has continued to use the cause and effect language that's there. And folks, really, Beth and I have commentary stems and videos that we model exactly what to do. I make my kids go from the word because to consequently since, to therefore or thus, and then the phrase due to the fact that. I make my kids have at least 3 sentences of commentary that use that language. But the truth is that strong commentary, folks, is going to have cause and effect language in it. And so cause and effect language is what you want to look for. Once you put evidence in a body paragraph, your next 3 sentences should have words like because, since, consequently, so that, due to, thus, and therefore. If you're not seeing that language, you're not providing enough commentary. And if you're trying to get better at commentary, you want to use those words more. Okay. And like I said, Beth and I have tons of videos about that where you can actually click on in the video description and get a worksheet that has all of those words on there for you. Okay, good. Ariana asked a great question here, though. Ariana said, what is the main thing to focus on the commentary? I always find myself rewording the evidence instead of actually evaluating it.
And that's really common, not just in rhetorical analysis, but I think we also see that a lot in synthesis too. And
Oh,
so,
yeah.
like, especially synthesis. So we want to remember that we're not trying to summarize what the writer said. You've already told us that essentially in your quote, but we want to be thinking about why. Like, why did they say that? What's the effect? That type of thing. So remember that you're trying to prove why. And I think what Tim said earlier is something that is really helpful. It's something that I've talked to some of my students about.
Beth, I'm gonna pause you for 1 second though. I'm gonna just clarify. I'm gonna say a yeah, in. Okay, you're trying to prove why by explaining how.
How? Yes.
There we go. Sorry, Beth. You got.
No, you're good.
Sorry.
So one of the things that I really get it from my sophomores because I teach multiple grades. I'll ask them a question about, like, why does the author do this? And they'll look at me as if it's super obvious and almost like a trick question, and it's not. But so they know the answer, but sometimes that answer doesn't find its way into the essay. And I think that's kind of to validate what Tim was saying earlier. That's also where the commentary can come from. We don't want to be summarizing. And so if you're really struggling with it, use words like because or synonyms for shows. So, because shows is kind of like uses, it's another potentially weaker verb, but you can elevate it with highlights, emphasizes. Underscores is a good one for y'all to know because sometimes they use underscores on the multiple choice. And so I would say if you're struggling with your commentary, start with, do I have a because? And do I have some synonym for shows? Am I telling why and how? And even if you feel like you're being repetitive in your commentary, I feel like that would be a better thing to do than to just summarize it. Because that's another concern I think students have is like, what if my commentary is really repetitive? But sometimes we just got to get it on paper first, and then we can address that later.
And what's better about that is that even if it's repetitive commentary, if it's not summarizing what's going on, it's going to get you to a 1-2 instead of a 1-1. Exactly. And a 1-2-0 is better than a 1-1-0. Now, somebody asked this question. That says, how do I actually start? Like, how do I avoid saying the word "this" in my commentary? Like for the example, this means this matters because this also connects to. Now, I have a really easy way to do that, but I'm going to let you address it first.
Oh, goodness. Okay. So
unless you want me to just straight address it.
I was going to say, well, I don't know that it's a direct answer, but some of the sentence frames that my students like are things like given that or due to or considering. I don't know if that would fix every single this one, but those are some of the other sort of lead-ins that I see commonly. But what's your advice?
Okay, so my advice is as follows. When a student says this, well, all right, let's go back to my example about the narrating the story from the childhood to make people sad, right? So you have your topic sentence. So-and-so narrates a childhood story in order to evoke sadness in the audience. Cool. You put the story in as your textual evidence. And then it says, so this makes people sad because, well, instead of putting the word this there, I want to know specifically what the word this is referring to, because this is a pronoun. That means it takes the place of something actual. And so I would rather a student actually pull down and say, oh, by talking about that time that she fell off the bike, it would move people to be sad because. And it's like, good. So whatever your word this is, that whatever you're talking about, That's what you want to look back at. So I tell my kids to start their commentary typically with an ing verb. Mentioning blank will evoke sadness because, or, you know, reminding someone of blank would do this because. And having that ing verb there allows you to, right, including blank. And the typical ing verbs that I use, I say you can always fall back on mentioning and including. Mentioning and including. And because of that, that could be the first sentence. Mentioning and including, go right. You want to pull back to your evidence here. Mentioning and including this part from my evidence, and then specifically say what parts you're looking for.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that's a great way to also potentially not only refer back to your choice, but you can even use that to include a direct quote. The other thing I was thinking of while you were saying that is that sometimes when students say, like, this is important because, or this shows that, really they could also work on combining that thought with the previous thought for a more advanced syntax anyway. Like sometimes it feels like we're saying something in two sentences that really perhaps should be one sentence anyway. So that might be an alternative too, especially if you feel like your writing is very simplistic or staccato. It might help to also perhaps combine sentences to address that issue as well.
So I got to write a comment here.
We're getting some really good tips in the chat, by the way.
No, I know. I'm actually super pumped about that, and it's nice because it's not a teacher saying it, right? Because we already know it. Good. What? All right. Somebody else. Yeah. So somebody wanted to know about the evaluating the language, and like I said, instead of just repeating it, evaluate it. Use the word because in that cause and effect language. Oh, somebody had a good synthesis question about DBQ and synthesis, but we'll deal with that in a little bit.
Yes.
As we segue there. Keep Coral High, Mrs. Williams. Shout out to you. We already shouted out to Mrs. Ake, but Mrs. Ake, shout out to you again. And then I'm trying to find, I felt like there was one other question in here that I was like, ooh, that's a good one. And I don't remember what it was. Bummer. Well, hey, let's actually talk about that pesky sophistication point here for a moment before we start shifting a little bit towards synthesis and then finishing our night. And we'll start with synthesis and move into argument next time. So tell me about that pesky sophistication point here, because people want to know it, want to know how to earn it and stuff like that. What do you got, Beth?
Okay, so the sophistication point can be earned in multiple ways. The one thing that I do want to say is if you are struggling with your evidence and commentary, I would focus on that as opposed to sophistication, because I think sometimes people sort
Yep.
of like they try to prioritize that. And also, I want to clarify a possible misconception too. I had a student ask me, can you still get a 5 on the exam if you don't get the sophistication point? And yes, you can. You do not need, it's not like the sophistication point unlocks a higher score or something. So just to
Right.
clarify that possible misconception. But sophistication needs to be consistent throughout. And it's essentially kind of going above and beyond. And so there's different ways to earn it. One way, I think that for my students, the easiest way is by examining that broader context and really digging into the rhetorical situation. Especially, they love it when I give them a historical prompt because they tend to find that their way in. So that would be one way. Another way would be a, vivid and persuasive style.
Yeah.
And that one, I think maybe sounds intimidating, but there are some kind of quick fixes that I think you and I have spoken about before, you
Oh yeah.
know, so we could address that in a second.
Yeah.
But those are a couple of the ways to earn the sophistication point. But I do want to clarify that while it is admirable to shoot for it, we do not want to obsess over that point.
Yeah. Honestly. And, for me, I actually think the easiest way to earn the sophistication point is the vivid and persuasive style. And what I mean by that is if you can write really well with your sentence structures and how you flow into things, that shows up to be significantly stronger than a lot of your peers. So, for example, Beth and I give sentence frames that are actually properly punctuated and we give good advice. And for me with my students, I'll give them my sentence frames, but then I'll say, hey, can we actually change the flow of this sentence? So instead of saying, Kelly begins by doing A in order to B, can I say, accomplishing B, Kelly begins by blah, blah, blah. Or at the beginning of the piece, in order to B, Kelly begins by A. And teaching that kind of sentence variation where it's still well punctuated, and it has all the parts that we need in a strong topic sentence, that's a good thing. Then I also teach my students how to really make their language, like the quotes, flow in with their language. So my students never say in the text it says or in the text it states. They don't say Kelly says, they don't say Kelly states. They'll always use their own language and flow into the quotes that they want. That's sophisticated stuff. So now you've got varied sentence structure, you've got flowing quotes. Let's say they've got some detailed commentary all the way throughout that has some nice complex sentence structure. And then they throw a really cool conclusion on there. That's going to look sophisticated. And so because of that, I don't think that the vivid and persuasive style is as hard as kids make it out to be. And I also tell my kids to strive to also use at least one piece of advanced punctuation if they know how to use it, especially in their conclusion. In the last sentence of their conclusion, I tell them to use a colon as like in that last sentence. Show them that you know how to use a colon really well, but use dashes and semicolons as long as you know how to use them. Now, this is kind of like putting on makeup, right? Because if someone puts on too much makeup, he or she will look like a clown. But if somebody puts on just the right amount, then and because he or she knows how to do it, it's going to look really, really good. Yeah.
Yes. And also, before we move on, just one thing to add too is not just the advanced punctuation, because as a reader, I love to see when a student uses a colon in a meaningful way.
Delightful. Seriously.
It's a moment.
I
But
know.
also, something that you and I have spoken about before is adding in that more precise language. So don't underestimate the power of adjectives and adverbs, because I think sometimes we forget they exist as we're writing, perhaps.
Yeah.
And then there is a third way to earn the sophistication point that I didn't mention previously, which is analyzing the complexity and tension, which, to be honest, that's the one I probably award it for the least. But I will say that there are some prompts that sort of lend itself to that. So I like to use the Abigail Adams prompt and the Gandhi prompt when I'm kind of going over complexity and tension because of the relationships there. Those are the ways that we could earn it. And if you're a student trying to get better, at least for me, I tend to recognize that some students do better from seeing a model, and the College Board does have some samples available. And so if you're looking to perhaps try to earn that point and see how you can do it, sometimes I think it's helpful to see real examples of student writing and kind of use that as a guide or a mentor to see, okay, yeah, so they did this, and here's how I could apply it to my next essay. Because I think us just giving you all these tips, while that can be great, sometimes just seeing it in action is also really helpful.
Okay. We're going to start shifting towards synthesis, but I want to look at this comment that came in here. It says, do short sentences or sentence length variation in general help? Or is it better to prioritize getting your ideas and commentary out? Honestly, it's better to prioritize getting your ideas and commentary out unless you're already able to do that. Then Beth and I are saying the sophistication, like this is not something that you're going to pick up overnight. It's something that you have to practice in class. So if you can practice in class, purposely varying your sentences, I want long ones here, I want short ones here, I want to have an adverbial clause here and things like that. That is something you practice and become part of your sophisticated writing. You just have to purposely practice that. On test day, though, if you're like, I ain't there yet, right? Or this is not my natural writing style, get the ideas on the paper. Okay?
Yeah, content is the most important for sure.
Now, we are going to start shifting towards synthesis. I wanted to point out one of the few things that I sell at the Garden of English is called the AP Exam Prep. I have an entire guide that goes through all 9 units of the course and exam description that goes through all the content that you need to know that pairs well with my YouTube videos and teach you how to write. If you are interested in getting that, it's kind of like a video version of like a 5 steps to a 5 types of thing with like practice exams and practice multiple choice and stuff like that. There is a link down below. You have no obligation though. I just want to make sure that you know that it's there. If you're like, you know what, I'd like to go through the content of this course and not just talk about writing, because my writing videos are all free, but those actually go through every element of the course content, and they actually have they have a U.S. history match as well. So every unit has like a test, and There are 20 multiple choice questions that you can look through, and there are practice exams and stuff. There's a whole U.S. history practice exam, so it's an AP Lane exam, but with U.S. history stuff as the foundation for it. But anyway, let's talk about synthesis now that I put that in there.
All right, so synthesis. First of all, just want to clarify what it is because sometimes I notice students kind of are like, "Wait, which one's that one?" If I say Q1, they're like, "Oh, is that synthesis?" So synthesis is the one with the sources. You're going to be given 6 to 8 sources. Usually it's 6, but it can be 7 or 8. And typically 2 of the sources are going to be a visual text. It might be something quantifiable. You might see a chart or a graph. They have done cartoons, they've done photographs, they've done a schedule. I think some of my students like those because they think they're easier because they don't have to read
Yeah.
anything. But sometimes those don't actually lend itself to the argument you're trying to make.
Yeah.
But your job with synthesis, a lot of us use an analogy, kind of like the TV show Chopped, where you're
Yeah.
given these sources, right? And just like they're given ingredients on Chopped, and you have to use the ingredients to make your essay. You need to use 3 of them. That is probably the most crucial thing to understand at the start of this, because if you do not have 3, it drastically hurts your score. And it does, as someone who read synthesis last year for the AP Lang exam, it really truly helps if you have proper citations because while we can award you credit for something that's not cited properly, make it easy on your reader, please. But basically, you're using the sources to support your argument. It's not a summary. So you're not trying to tell us what all the sources say, but rather you're trying to assert a position. You're trying to, take a stance. And it could be about the role of something or about factors of something. But your job is to use the sources to support your argument. It's kind of like a mini research paper.
Yeah. Now, I do have a question about this. Someone asked when I produce a synthesis, because it's an argument with the sources, like you had mentioned, right? That mini research paper type of a thing. Develop your own argument about this, but support it with sources. Somebody did ask, would, what was it here? It was, okay, if I produce a counterclaim, will that help me get the sophistication point or improve my grade?
So it can, but it's not guaranteed. I think it's important to recognize that addressing the counter argument can lead to a nuanced argument, but just because you include that does not automatically make your argument more sophisticated. It also has to do with like the nuanced thought and the execution of it as well. So I personally tell my students to consider it and see if they feel it fits in their essay and where it fits best. But I don't make it mandatory that my students include that every time because sometimes I feel like that adds additional pressure for a timed essay that they don't need. But that's just how I run my classroom. But as far as the exam, um, it can be nice, but it also does not guarantee the sophistication point.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that we have to kind of get used to. The content in AP English classes is different than any other class. And the reason why is because, hold on a second, I have to add a link to the chat here. One of the reasons why is because kids want to just know, like, what do I have to do to earn maximum points? But the truth is you have to be a good writer. Yes. And you have to be a good communicator. In a lot of other classes, like in history, they just want to see that you actually have some context in the DBQ. Can you contextualize this in history? Doesn't matter if the sentence sounds good, right? And I'm actually going to put, bye, Corbin. I'm going to put a video in the chat. This video that I just put in the chat is me going over with Tom Ritchie the difference between a DBQ and a synthesis. And, kids are like, can I do this to get that point? Can I do this to get that point? And the answer is probably it can help earn that point, but it's not necessarily going to earn that point because you have to be able to show that you can communicate in English, right? As opposed to in history, you need to show that you know these certain things about those certain time periods. And if you communicate it and it's not as clear, like you can still get the point for that. There's no perfect formula where it's like I can just do this and not have to think and know that I can do really, really well. Does that make sense, Beth?
Yes.
Yeah.
There was a really good question in the chat too about essentially, how do you ensure that the sources are working in conversation for a synthesis essay? Because a lot of us teachers use that expression, like it's a conversation of sources.
Yeah.
I realize the more I've taught and said that, sometimes students are like, but wait, what do you mean by that? Like, what is a conversation? How do I start a conversation with sources? So I think that's worth talking about too. One of the things that I think is helpful to mention is so we call it a conversation of sources because if you think about a conversation, there's typically multiple voices in that conversation. And in a conversation that you have with, say, your peers or a family member, you might agree about certain things, disagree about certain things. And so we're looking for the relationship between the sources. That's one tip that I give my students as we're just starting synthesis is as they're going through the sources. And once they get to like source B, source C, that kind of thing, I ask them to pause for a second and think about, okay, how are these sources related? Do they agree on certain points? Do they disagree? What's the relationship there? And then as a new source enters the chat, if you will, as like we add in another source, we want to be thinking about how does this contribute to the conversation? And
Yeah.
I think that influences how I tend to encourage students to structure their body paragraphs because I've seen a lot of essays for synthesis where the student wrote 3 body paragraphs and had one source per paragraph. And it felt kind of like they were summarizing the sources. At least sometimes the paragraphs felt disconnected. And so when you have 2 sources in a paragraph, and this is not a rule, by the way, but it can be a suggestion at times, that starts that conversation. And it also, to me, it makes it more convincing because if you have 2 credible sources proving your point, then to me, that's at least more convincing than one, So just something to think about with this whole conversation element as well.
Yeah. And I think that, I really appreciate what's put in here, the idea that like, hey, it extends, it corroborates, it disputes, right? Having some good verbs here, you can actually look at the sources and say, hey, this source supports this one. Good. Well, then let's try to take a small section from this source and get it into the same sentence as a section from this source that actually supports it, right? So you write your sentence, so and so, the author of blah, 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 highlights how yada, 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 which is then reinforced when so and so produces blah, blah, blah. You have now put these in a conversation where these elements support one another. And so we want to think about it in those terms. But Beth and I both have videos about writing synthesis body paragraphs, and we have templates for source integration based on the relationship that you're trying to convey. And we do have models for that as well. It's one of those things where you just don't want to say source A says, source B says. You want to try to say, how can I combine certain snippets of ideas from sources? And actually, I have a reading strategy that is meant to help kids plan for that on my synthesis playlist that y'all can access at the Garden of English. Now, Beth, I do understand that it is getting very close to time to go. Okay, there are 2 questions here that I want to answer. So we're going to answer these 2. The first one's going to be about the DBQ in history. And the
Okay.
second one is going to be this one right here from Kara that says, in synthesis, are there any tips when most of the sources support the idea opposing mine? And
That's a good question.
we're going to answer that one last, but I want to just address the DBQ thing here. Okay. Gee, Ms. Ake is super popular. My goodness. I'm sure it's a good thing, by the way. I just know
Yeah.
that I need Ms. Ake. So Ms. Ake, if you ever go to the reading and you see me, please make sure that you introduce yourself to me because your kids think you are fire. All right. So nonetheless, the DBQ part. Someone asked, are there strategies that someone has adopted from the DBQs that can be used in synthesis? And the truth is I think that the strategy that you want to use the most is reading for the historical context of the piece. So when you're reading an article in synthesis, if you know what's going on in the time it was written, because you can see the date right in the citation. If it's 2019, okay, what was culture like in 2019 in the United States at that time? That can help you interpret what the message is a little bit more. But honestly, the way that sources are used in the DBQ are not the same as the way sources are used in synthesis. And so because of that, although the essay type is similar in terms of you have to pull from sources to create an essay, it's really quite different. My friend Tom in the video that I posted in the chat earlier even told me, he's like, you can score really well and write a pretty poorly written history essay and still get almost maximum points. if you write a poorly written English essay, you're not going to get above a 120. It's just not going to happen. And so when it comes to that, I want to just have you be wary of saying, if I do this in my DBQ, this will automatically translate to my synthesis. I have never seen that actually happen. However, on the flip side, I had students who were in AP history. Well, it was AP US at the time or AP Euro. I can't remember, one of the two. And they were like, we kind of feel like our teacher didn't go over the writing structure as much. And this was years and years ago. And I was like, okay, do you know how to integrate sources? And they said, yes. And I said, then just do it that way. And sure enough, their papers came back fine, because they had to express their content, but they could do it clearly because of how they dealt with their synthesis papers. So DBQ doesn't necessarily translate to synthesis, but synthesis translates to DBQ, except for the fact that a lot of times my history teacher friends are like, I do not need the kids to directly quote the sources. They can paraphrase, they can summarize. I really require my kids to directly quote sources as they build their conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Any comments about DBQ stuff? And for folks, more of that conversation with Tom Ritchie, who's an AP history guru, you can see that video that's in the chat there. But before we answer that last question, anything about the DBQ, Beth?
Not really, other than just one thing that my A-push teacher has said is that the more I've focused on writing style in my class, she can tell, because she said, students are putting colons in their DBQs. And she's like, I think they're right. So that's the other benefit of the class, is that, stylistically it's helping them improve. But yes, they're similar, but they're separate. And so don't try to write a synthesis essay like a DBQ. There are, like, it's not a direct correlation.
Yeah. And then what was that last one we had? It was from Kara. What was our question?
It was about when
yeah.
the sources support the idea that opposes the student's perspective.
That's right, Beth. I'm gonna let you give that advice. I'll give mine, and then we'll sign out of here for the night. So here we go. Oh, shout out to Mr. Altieri. Mr. Altieri, shout out to you. Anyway, yes.
So I guess one thing to keep in mind is, first of all, I really want students to plan their essay, like come up with a really quick kind of tentative outline before you start. Make sure that you have a clear position, that you know how you're going to use your sources before you start writing. Because now it's digital, but it used to break my heart when I would see essays written by hand where a student would get like 2 paragraphs in and cross the whole thing out and start over.
Yep. All that
So
time.
have a good plan first, because if you know that it's not going to fit, I think you kind of have to, in the moment, figure out, okay, can I incorporate a source here as like a counter argument? Like, can I refute one of the opposing sources? Or, as I was telling one of my students in my sophomore class earlier this week, we were doing a prompt, and he said, if I had to pick a side in real life, I would pick this. However, based on the sources, it would be way easier to argue this. And so I told him, for the sake of the assignment in class, sometimes it might just be the path of least resistance, because nobody's going to track you down and be like, well, do you really believe this? So just, and you would, that's why I advocate for outlining, is because if you can realize that before you start writing, it is so much easier to course correct.
Yeah. You know what's so funny, Beth, is that my advice was going to be that, right? It was going to be, if you notice that most of the sources actually go against your opinion on the matter and what you intended on arguing, change your opinion for the essay. Write the easier paper. Now, the only time that I actually disagree with that, though, is if there were a topic that there's something that you're morally connected to or religiously connected to, where that's like an integral part of your character, that don't toss that up. You go and you do what you got to do. But most synthesis topics are not like that. You know what I mean? I would suggest that in the "Is college worth the cost?" No. You know what? I'll do the libraries prompts. From 2017, there was a libraries prompt. And that libraries prompt, most of the sources made it indicative that libraries are an important part of the community. Now, I could have very well thought that libraries were obsolete, which I don't, by the way, but I could have. And there was one source that agreed with that. So I was like, oh my word, what's the easier paper to write? That the role of the library in the future is actually supposed to be as a community, as a grounds for community building, to foster education. And that should be my argument because it's the easiest thing. Um, because that's the easiest thing. So, um, anyway, nonetheless, I agree. Change your opinion and then go write the easier paper, the path of less resistance. I don't suggest that in college. We're talking about test day strategies here.
Right.
I'm not telling you to give up on your morals. I'm not telling you to give up on your arguments. I'm telling you that on test day, if you realize it's going to be easier for you to write a more complete argument, even if it's something that you don't necessarily agree with, that's okay. That's okay. You're showing the argument skill. You're not denying your character here. Somebody asked, are crack AP's practice multiple choice questions accurate or are they outdated? If they are the latter, which should I practice? I know nothing about crack AP. Do you know anything about crack AP?
I haven't looked at it in a long time. It was shut down for a while because I don't know that they were supposed to be putting the stuff out there that they were.
Gotcha.
If it has four multiple choice answers, then it's closer in terms of alignment. If it's five, it's probably older. But I think if it's a site I'm thinking of, they were perhaps using resources that were supposed to be secure. So I personally, without looking into it more, could not advocate for that
Yeah.
without further, without more clarification.
Yep. And I also need to give a shout out to Ms. Cody again. So Ms. Cody, your kids have been shouting you out all night, and I think that we already hooked you up. But shout out again to you, Ms. Cody. One other thing about that, someone said, "Well, what can I use to practice my multiple choice?" Well, first of all, you can ask. Let's talk about free stuff first, okay? So that nobody's like, "Freitas, why are you always pushing your crap?" No, we're here to do this for free, but we're doing this for free, and there are other things that we have. Free stuff first. Go ask your teacher to open up stuff in AP Classroom. Your teacher can assign a million things and does not have to grade them. And some kids can do them, some kids cannot. I do that for my students all the time. So I open like 15 different things like that. Another good resource that you could pick up that I make absolutely no money on, although I am tied to it, is the AMSCO book. That's full of multiple choice questions. But if you buy the AMSCO book, you're not going to get the answer guide. So just a heads up with that because it's actually a textbook and those go to teachers and whatnot. I also want to remind people that there is an ultimate review. Well, sorry, no, I'm not going to use that language because it's going to be called the exam prep guide as of July 1st. There is a Garden of English exam prep guide in the description down below that goes through this entire course. And that exam prep guide has unit tests that are multiple choice, and they were written by me and or other people who have very close ties to what's going on with the AP world. So they're remarkably accurate. The only thing that's not accurate right now is that the two practice tests have 5 answer selections instead of 4. So I encourage you to check that out if you're looking for something a little bit extra, but please note that is paid. I don't want anybody to feel obligated to get that. I don't want you to be like, Freitas, you're trying to force us to buy this crap. No, we are here to help you. I'm just telling you of a resource because it answers a question. So please note such things there. And if you're like, I ain't going to buy that out of principle because you mentioned it during your live stream. Okay, then don't. Think I'm a jerk. It's okay. I don't mind. It's just there, and it could potentially help kids prepare. Beth, any closing words before we go?
I just wanted to say thank you everybody for joining us
Yeah,
because y'all have been excellent in the chat. And I especially want to thank the teachers that are present as well as the students. But Tim and I consider the teachers here our colleagues. We love seeing your names in the shout outs in the chat
for
and the
sure.
support that you give. So thank you to those who are watching and also to students. By the way, the replay will be available on Tim's channel. And if you missed the first one of these where we talked more about multiple choice, then you can go back and watch that. And also, don't forget, April 24th, Tim is going to be here with Katie Storms talking
Yep.
more about synthesis and I believe argument. And then I'll be back the night before the exam on the 13th, and we'll be kind of covering everything then. And then also, if you're looking for additional support, Tim and I mentioned we both have YouTube channels. It really helps us if you subscribe, if you
Yeah.
watch those videos. And also I am on TikTok. I'm not as active as I used to be just because, is it coming? Is it going? Is it staying? Whatever. But I do
Yeah.
have several like shorter form videos there, and I do tend to go live on that as the exam approaches as well. So if YouTube is not your main form of, social media and you prefer TikTok, I would love a follow on that platform as well.
We really appreciate that George was here. And I also want to just point out, and this is the first time I'm publicly saying this on anything Garden of English, but normally I get pretty busy during exam prep season with AP Lit and AP Lang stuff. But this year, it is very hard for me to get busy. And the reason why is because we are packing up our house in Massachusetts, and we are moving to Las Vegas, Nevada this summer. I have received a job offer from a school in Las Vegas, and I have agreed to that job offer. So I don't want anybody to think that like we're going to Vegas because we can live this glamorous lifestyle. Nope, I'm still a teacher. But it was an opportunity that I just could not pass up, and it's something that I'm excited for. So if I'm not producing material, but Beth is producing more material, make sure that you go support her as best you can. We appreciate, shout out to Banning High School in Wilmington, California, and the lovely students that are there. And Beth, I really just appreciate you. And you know what? I think I'm going to ask Katie if she wants to join us on that cram night the day before. George,
Absolutely.
thank you for stepping in for Lexi in the chat there and doing what you had to do. And I hope to see you all at another time.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone.